In the aftermath of the disaster, the aid efforts were remarkable. There was a significant risk of famine at that time, and yet aid began coming from everywhere. And the military dispersed its own supplies on a massive scale, and the hundreds of thousands of homeless were housed in military tents and newly constructed cabins. It's really quite remarkable. General Funston describes some of the efforts. The rations, tents, and blankets on hand at the army posts adjacent to the city were dealt out to the sufferers with no account of the responsibility involved, and within 2 days, relief supplies from neighboring states and cities and army supplies from various army posts had begun to arrive and were being distributed. He adds, the sick from the city hospitals and many of those injured in the earthquake were sent to the General Hospital of the Presidio. The Hearst Relief Corps, with a number of well-equipped hospitals and a complement of physicians and nurses, arrived from Los Angeles and rendered excellent service. In a few days, conditions were as normal as could be expected under the circumstances, and the work of feeding and sheltering the homeless thousands proceeded in a systematic manner. In the aftermath, people wandering the ruins were likely to be put to work in cleaning up the ruins. Arnold Gentha experienced that. When going around trying to take photographs of the disaster, he experienced it several times being put to work. He describes that in his account, which is in another video, and you should absolutely go and watch it because it's awesome. And furthermore, I put into that video a lot of before and after photos of various places in the disaster, so you can really see what it looked like and what happened. There was also an enormous backlash against corruption. It was said prior to that time that the business of City Hall was done not in City Hall, but at a saloon near City Hall, where anyone with sufficient cash could speak with the mayor. That was what was said, anyway. At any rate, the construction materials used in building City Hall were extremely inferior compared to what they were supposed to be, which is part of why it collapsed in such a dramatic way. And after the disaster, people were not having that. And they were looking to scapegoat people, especially their former leaders. Another major thing was Chinatown. Chinatown had been, prior to that point, a literal ghetto. When Chinese people left Chinatown, they were at high risk of being beaten by white people just for being outside of Chinatown. The racism at this time was horrifying. And when Chinatown burned, along with the rest of downtown, a lot of white people were very excited to take the land from them. So in the end, what saved Chinatown? Good old-fashioned greed. The Chinese Empire made it clear that it would not accept the removal of Chinatown unless the locals wished to go, and that furthermore, it wasn't moving its consulate unless they did, and that the city had absolutely no authority to move its consulate. The local Chinese leaders also pointed out that there was no guarantee that the Chinese population would actually settle wherever it was they were now deemed to have to go, and that if they settled elsewhere, where will your pool of cheap labor go? Furthermore, the city's removal efforts were stymied by racism, in that the Chinese were blocked from living in a wide variety of places, which meant that moving them away from the place you now want to block was incredibly difficult. In the end, fearful of losing its lucrative trade with China and its pool of cheap labor, the city decided to let people stay on their own property, Chinatown. Another major effect is that the population shifted away from San Francisco. So many people during the disaster and afterwards were desperate to get away to Oakland or Alameda or anywhere else. And a lot of people went to Los Angeles because that's so far from this land of earthquakes. Yeah, that didn't work out too well. And you can really see this in the demographics. In the census of 1900, compared to the census of 1910, the population of California grows by 60%. And yet, San Francisco's share, the The Paris of the West, from 1900 to 1910, grew by only 21.5%, whereas Oakland grew by 124%, and Los Angeles grew by 213%. Los Angeles went from a population of 102,000 in 1900 to 319,000 in 1910. They were said to be, by the way, the damnedest finest ruins, and that's an exact quote. One emblem of that was the portals of the past, a famous photo by Arnold Genta, and it became quite iconic of the disaster. In fact, so iconic that the portals were preserved. Even when the ruin behind them was knocked down and the city gradually rebuilt, the portals were actually moved to Golden Gate Park, where they remain as a monument to the disaster. To aid the city in rebuilding, the powerful figures of San Francisco initiated the greatest case of insurance fraud in history, an enormous cover-up, the gist of which was that the city was not badly damaged even by the earthquake. It was a tiny bit of damage, really. It was the fire that burned it. Anywhere can have a fire. Chicago just had a major one only a few decades prior. Any place can have a fire. There's nothing wrong with this land here. It wasn't the earthquake. That was the tiny little pipsqueak things. Yeah, it didn't really damage the city. No. To prove that point, that, deranged point, they actually doctored a lot of photographs and dispatched them through the press. Hearst was one of the people doing this, to make it look like the buildings were undamaged before burning. To a contemporary audience accustomed to Photoshop, you can look at these pictures and go, that's basically been painted, that's not even realistic looking. But to an audience in 1906, who might not even be aware that photos can be doctored, that convinced some of them. And a lot of insurance companies were willing to pay out, and that helped a lot. The city needed investment to rebuild. By 1915, the city was eager to prove that it was back. The Paris of the West had been rebuilt. That hadn't actually finished, but they were very eager to prove the point. And they hosted a World's Fair, the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exhibition. And it was glorious and beautiful. It was meant to signify to the world, San Francisco is back, and it's open for business. Do bring your business. Before this can be concluded with a message of hope, it's the amazing resilience of the people, as exemplified with this headline. While ruins still smoke, work begins on the new city. A fire, no matter how great, cannot burn out the human spirit. And the city in 1906 really proved that. There, be sure to like and subscribe for more of the fantastical stories that history is full of. There are going to be more, and they're all, every one of them, going to be completely awesome. See you then.